From the First War on, the Gnomes were always well liked and highly regarded by other members and races of the Alliance. They too had witnessed the devastating attacks made by the orcs, and made their choice to strike back. Interestingly, during the Second War, the Gnomes were not afforded their own representative at meetings between the different factions, but instead were represented by a dwarven delegate from Ironforge. This might have been seen as an insult by other members and races of the Alliance, but the Gnomes for their part took no offense, and instead provided all they could to serve the Alliance during the Second War against the orcs. The Alliance greatly relied on gnomish technology and machines of war to fight the orcs, and this technology helped them to win the war and push the orcs back through the Dark Portal. They also fought alongside their Alliance allies in hand-to-hand combat. The Gnomes were indeed an integral part to winning the Second War, and were beloved by their allies. When the Scourge hit Lordaeron, once again Alliance members and races sent soldiers to aid and fight, but mysteriously, there was one group that was absent from the Alliance forces. It quickly became apparent to the Alliance that the Gnomes were hardly to be found in Lordaeron, and few Gnomes were seen fighting the Scourge that was decimating the area. With the Third War well underway, there were some Gnomish armaments sent to Lordaeron, but there was little in the way of actual soldiers and pilots. This angered many members of the Alliance, and the entire Gnomish race's loyalty was called into question. The once loyal race who helped fight off orc invaders were now mysteriously gone from the battlefield. So why did the Gnomes not help the Alliance fight the Scourge on the fields in Lordaeron during the Third War? Unbeknown to the Alliance, it was the Gnomes' plan all along to send soldiers to the battlefield and help during the Third War, but before they could dispatch their armies north, Gnomeregan fell under attack and was under heavy siege. This attack was not at the hands of the deadly Scourge itself, or later by the Lich King, but by other creatures known as Trogs. It was these Trog attackers that kept the Gnomes from sending armies north to Lordaeron. The Trogs were only now becoming a threat in the Eastern Kingdom. They remained dormant for thousands of years, sleeping in an ancient fortress known as Uldaman. They would have remained sleeping had it not been for a random encounter between the Trogs and Dwarves of Ironforge. The Dwarves journeyed to Uldaman in a search for important artifacts and knowledge for their own use, but instead ended up waking up the brutish and gruesome Trogs. Those dwarves who weren't slain at the hands of the Trogs barely made it back to Ironforge alive, and many of them would never forget the terror they witnessed in the ancient fortress. They believed they had escaped the Trogs and were not followed, but they were only partially correct in this assessment. The Trogs much preferred to travel underground, and began to hunt the dwarves from deep underground. As they approached the great city of Ironforge, something caught the attention of the Trogs that made them momentarily put their hunt on hold. They began to hear strange noises and sounds that they had never heard before. For them, these sounds were not natural, but artificial, and it was decided that they would need to be investigated further to make out exactly what they were and what they could learn from them. What the Trogs eventually learned was that they were hearing the huge factories right in the heart of Gnomeregan, the capital of the Gnomes. These unnatural noises lured them to the city, and they began using their huge claws to tunnel faster towards the unsuspecting Gnomes and their great capital. The Trogs finally breached through the lower levels of Gnomeregan. Of course, there was no resistance as the Gnomes were not even aware of their brutish attackers from deep below the city. With this, the Trogs began their invasion of the Gnome capital. The Gnomes were no match for the much stronger, larger, and battle-ready attackers. What the Gnomes did have, however, was a far superior mental advantage over their foe, and their leader, High Tinker Galban Mekatork, used this to his and his people's advantage as best he could. He relied on what the Gnomes knew best, their skills in science and engineering, as well as their high level of ingenuity and technical savviness. The battle between the Gnomes and the Trogs began, and the Gnomes fought hard for their leader and capital. Remaining as calm as ever, Galban Mekatork devised a plan to station both soldiers and machines of war throughout various choke points in the capital to try to keep the Trog invaders from breaching the city further. Unfortunately for the Gnomes, the Trogs were not so easily contained, as they continued to burrow and dig through the earth to get past the well-guarded defenses. Although the Gnomes' technology was far superior, their army was too small to fight off the bigger and stronger invaders. For a brief moment, Mekatork thought of calling upon the Alliance for help in this battle, but he quickly thought better of the idea. For Mekatork, protecting Lordaeron from the Scourge was viewed with the utmost importance, and he did not want to divert necessary and important resources from the area. He also viewed the Northern campaign so important he made the decision not to tell any of the Alliance and his allies about the Trogg invasion that decimated his capital and his fellow gnomes. He chose instead to keep the invasion a secret from the Alliance while they fought the Scourge. It would not be until years later that the Alliance finally learned of the events that transpired in Gnomeregan, and why the gnomes were absent from the fight against the Scourge in Lordaeron. Had it not been for the Trogg invaders, the gnomes would have been there once again fighting side by side with the Alliance, not only supplying soldiers and armies, but also their incredible technology to defeat the Scourge. Once the Alliance found out about the events that occurred in the gnome capital, their loyalty was no longer questioned. They were considered heroes for their sacrifices that they made in the name of the Alliance.